Welcome to Ecclesia Principles, a biblical strategy for believers to engage in God's design for government with Ray Eppard.
Hello, glad you could join us again today. We are looking at Ecclesia Principles, which is basically God's rules for government, and we're now talking about separation of powers. We've established a while back that is a biblical principle. But what I'm wanting to look at this week and what we're examining is that the separation of powers goes beyond the separation of powers within government. But it is the separation of the four different jurisdictions that God has established: self-government, family government, civil government, and church government. Those four jurisdictions that God has established are really the separation of powers that God has created and instituted in the earth. Now, we're looking at Romans 13, and we spent a lot of time yesterday looking at verse 1. And so today we're going to go further into this passage because we just basically dealt, especially with the first 5 words, let every soul be subject. Again, so often when people read Romans 13, they think it's just dealing with people being subject to those in government. Now, there's 4 jurisdictions. Civil government's one of them. But if you would, children, obey your parents in the Lord. That is a governing authority that the children are to obey. Children are to obey their parents. They are to subject themselves and submit to the governing authority of the parents. Now, here's the thing, and I'll just go ahead and jump into this, I guess. But you see, unfortunately, right now, there is a movement within our nation to do away with these separation of powers as far as the jurisdictions. And in all honesty, they're really wanting to end up getting rid of them within civil government as well, because ultimately they just want to be able to do what they can do without any checks or balances. All of these are checks and balances. See, separation of the different branches or divisions of government are checks and balances within government. The separation of powers through the 4 jurisdictions is the checks and balances of life. Self-government, church government, family government, civil government, all of these are to provide a check and a balance to all of the others in life. These things, and as I also have stated, is that we're entering a phase in studying the Ecclesia Principles, God's rules for government, where we're really talking about things and their balance, having a balance between these things. Civil government has to stay intact. It is a creation of God. It has to stay intact. It serves a divine purpose as long as it's serving that purpose. Self-government has to stay intact, but those two have to be balanced. Family government is in there. It has to be balanced. Church government is in there. It has to be balanced. If that balance isn't provided, it moves into tyranny. And I don't think we'll get into that a lot today, but tyranny is really one person using the authority that was given to someone else, usurping that authority, taking that authority and exercising it as their very own. And originally, if you do an etymology of the word tyranny, you will find out it was not like we use it today. Today it's totally used in regard to someone doing something bad, becoming a dictator. No, the original meaning meant it didn't matter if they were doing it for the person's good or to hurt them. If they took their authority, if they took it from them in a manner of speaking, they were a tyrant. We need to understand that today, because being a tyrant is just that. It is taking someone else's rights away from them and exercising them yourself, because that is where the rubber begins to hit the road in a lot of the issues that we're facing today. And we're going to get to some of those, but I want to lay this groundwork first so you can see where I'm coming from and it not just be a political persuasion, but it is a biblical perspective. It is an ecclesia principle. Now, Romans 13:1 says, let every soul, be subject to the governing authorities, the four jurisdictions. Civil government recognizes self-government. Family government recognizes self-government. Church government should recognize self-government, and vice versa all the way around. All of them should accept and recognize the other's jurisdiction. He goes on, he says, for there is no authority except from God. That's because God is sovereign. God has all authority, and we only have authority if he has delegated it to us. There is no authority except from God, but he has delegated some of it to us, but it came from him. And since it came from him, we are accountable to God for how we use that authority, whether it's self-government, family government, civil government, or church government. All of those jurisdictions are accountable to God for how they use their authority. Now, he goes on, he says, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. God appointed self-government, family government, civil government, church government. He appointed that. He created those jurisdictions. Now, verse 2, therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. Now, let's break this down and let's take it a little bit different than we normally do, because again, most everyone reads this in relationship to civil government. We have to submit to civil government. But again, going back to let every soul be subject, that means the king has to be subject. That means the president has to be subject. That means Congress has to be subject. Therefore, let's keep that in mind in verse 2. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God. When civil government begins to take away the unalienable rights that belong to self-government or belong to the family or belong to the church, when civil government begins to take those away, they are resisting the ordinance of God. And he says, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. Now, at that point, and this is something that, if you would, the founding fathers evidently understood based on what they said, is that when the king was usurping the authority of the people, they had the right to make that change, to change the government, because if the judgment of God was going to come on the king because he was resisting the ordinance of God, but they didn't want the judgment of God, then they had the right to make the change. They had the right to make the change. Now, with this, notice he says they resist the ordinance of God. That tells us, again, whether you like the president or you don't like the president is the head of the executive branch of our government. And therefore, anything done to work against that should be done in a way that God authorizes. Let's just be very blunt. At that point, assassinations would not be approved by God. That is not the way to do it, because that position is the ordinance of God. If you look at King David, even though Saul was violating the jurisdictions of self-government, he was violating even the jurisdiction of faith. God had told Samuel to anoint David as king. Saul went about trying to kill David. David had multiple opportunities to take Saul's life, but he refused to do so. He said he would not touch God's anointed. And as a result of that, and he wouldn't let any of his people do it. He wouldn't let any of them attack Saul and kill him. The Apostle Paul, in the book of Acts, when he was being questioned one time by the high priest, and he made a comment, and one guy slapped him and said, you talk like this to the high priest? He said, I'm sorry, I didn't realize he was the high priest. At that point, even though that person, Saul, was not acting in obedience to God, that chief priest was not functioning in obedience to God, yet the honoring of the position, because the authority is from God, not necessarily how the person is using the authority. And the thing of it is they will have to give an account. Unfortunately, a lot of people think that whatever the leader wants, if Congress passes something and the president signs it, well, that must have been the will of God. Hogwash. That's totally 100% wrong. Just because people in authority pass something doesn't mean it's what God wants. Read the Old Testament. Read all of the kings that walked not in the ways of David their father, who kept the shrines in the high places, who offered offerings to Baal and so forth. The leaders did that. They were in disobedience to God, and because of that, judgment came on those nations during those kings' time periods. But you see, in this, we do need to have a proper respect for the position. But that doesn't mean we are not to work to change it. Because again, those who resist the authorities that God has established, if civil government resists self-government, then civil government is going to have judgment pour out on it. That's the way that's going to work, and it's what's going to happen. And if we do not want to be recipients of that judgment, then we need to work to change it. And Paul goes on, and he says, those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. At that point, we need to change bad government so that judgment does not come on our nation. We need to change bad government. But in so doing, we need to recognize the authority of those four jurisdictions. And we must subject ourselves, we must submit ourselves to those four jurisdictions. We have to make sure we maintain self-government. We need to maintain family government. We need to maintain civil government. Right now, you look at it and go, well, we might be better off without it. But no, it is an ordinance of God. There is a purpose for it. It just needs to be brought back into alignment with its purpose. Sometimes you look at church governments. Some churches, you go, oh my, how could they hurt people any more than they have? Well, the thing of it is, that happens. But at that point, God has established the church, and we need to work to do what we can to bring everything back into alignment with God. This is ultimately, again, the separation of powers. You maintain self-government. You maintain family government. You maintain civil government. You maintain faith, church government. You keep those in place, and you make sure that they have balance. You do not allow one to take the authority of the other. In so doing, life ends up having a balance that brings blessing to the people. God bless you. See you tomorrow.